Hello, and welcome to another part of my North American Tales of Retrospective. Finally, after a number of years. I know, but all that really matters is that it is back. The game we're making a glorious return to is the Game Boy Advance version of Tales of Phantasia. It's better than not getting it over here at all. Because, yeah, Phantasia is actually the very first Tales of game, but it didn't get a release outside of Japan until this. And this is a version that's, well, you'll see. Also, shout out to my friend Zero Master for giving me the box from his copy for this video. It's certainly better than holding up this stinky little cartridge for the camera. Anyway, Tales of Phantasia was originally released on December 15th, 1995 on the Super Famicom, being the aforementioned debut Tales of game by Wolf Team, a developer who beforehand made games such as Soul Feast,
more like Soul Feces,
and Ernest Evans. Yes, the makers of this quap-looking ass game would go on to make the Tales of series. Well, those that actually did stay on Wolf Team during those years. Because in 1993, Wolf Team's parent company Telenet merged with another subsidiary of theirs, Lasersoft, causing restructuring in most of the original team, including head Masashiro Akishino, to leave Wolf Team. After which, the studio would mostly make Sega CD ports of Laserdisc arcade games like Time Gal, Cobra Command, and Road Adventure, until Tales of Phantasia started development. Originally, the game was conceived from an unpublished novel, Tale of Phantasia, by Wolf Team programmer Yoshihiko Tanda, effectively making him the original concept creator and story writer along with programming the game. After unsuccessfully pitching to Enix, publishing was signed on by Namco. Unfortunately, creative disputes between Wolf Team and Namco during later development caused delays and most of Wolf Team to leave. Again, makes you wonder how many, if any at all, from the original Wolf Team were still around after that. Those that left included Gotanda, designer Masaki Norimoto, and Joe Asanuma, who formed Tri-Ace, making Star Ocean as their studio's first game. Coming out in 1996, it's another late Super Famicom JRPG that didn't get released outside Japan until years later. It being made by former Tales of Phantasia developers is why Star Ocean is pretty similar to Phantasia. They essentially share some of the same DNA. And ironically, the publisher for Star Ocean was Enix. Sure, Namco kind of pulled the "you made this, I made this" with Gotanda, but at least Star Ocean worked out for him. Despite the development issues, Tales of Phantasia was finished and released to positive reviews, with sales being initially slow due to Dragon Quest VI being out around that time, but gained some momentum later, selling about 212,000 copies in Japan. Of course, it didn't get released over here, likely due to being a late Super Famicom release that by the time it would have been localized, the Nintendo 64 would be out soon, not to mention Super Mario RPG would have likely overshadowed it. Plus, this was just before RPGs were about to really take off over here on the PlayStation 1. So I'd say it was a case of bad timing and might have been too costly to release Tales of Phantasia in North America on the Super Nintendo. However, Tales of Phantasia would of course be re-released, first to the PlayStation on December 23, 1998 in Japan, just over a year after Tales of Destiny. It was essentially a port on the Tales of Destiny game engine with additional features and content, but just like the original Phantasia, this version also didn't see an overseas release. This was due to not being able to localize the game in between Tales of Destiny and Eternia, as the Namco Home Tech translation team passed on that to focus their efforts on Eternia, since they felt that was a better game and had a greater chance of succeeding in the US market. While I do think Eternia is the better game, it did not sell that well over here, and I don't think Phantasia would have done any better. People at the time would probably just see PlayStation Phantasia and just go, "Ew, it looks like a Super Nintendo game," like with Destiny. And then copies would cost over $100 to try and get nowadays. Of course, Phantasia wouldn't just get ported to the PlayStation, as in August 1st, 2003, Japan got a Game Boy Advance version, made by the now established Namco Tales studio. This actually came about as part of a partnership deal Namco made with Nintendo in 2002, which also included developing Star Fox Assault and having Tales of Symphonia be an initial GameCube exclusive. Plus, Nintendo of America and Europe were actually the publishers for their releases, which came out in March 6th and 31st of 2006 respectively, nearly 3 years after the Japanese release. By then, the Nintendo DS had been out for about a year and a half, so you have to wonder why they waited until this late into the GBA lifecycle. I'm guessing it wasn't until after Symphonia did well in North America they realized, oh hey, maybe this series will do okay in the West now. But they might have wanted to wait until they released the English version along with the next Tales of game that would come out here, much like how they released their version only 4 weeks before Symphonia did in Japan. However, Tales of Rebirth, the following entry in 2004, didn't get released over here, likely due to having mainly 2D graphics, which was often discouraged for Western releases on the PlayStation 2. They may have put bringing GBA Phantasia over on hold if Namco did want this release close to a main entry. In November of 2005, Nintendo Vice President of Marketing and Sales Reggie Fils-Aimé announced that the GBA version of Phantasia was coming to North America and Europe, and it was released almost exactly 1 month after Tales of Legendia in North America. Although another reason it probably took as long as it did is that this wasn't translated by Namco or Nintendo America, but outsourced to Bone Global Solutions, a worldwide company that specializes in translation and localization. They were likely hired as there probably wasn't enough localization resources to translate that on top of Legendia and Tales of the Abyss. Now, granted, a lot of that was me making assumptions, as finding actual reasons for these localization decisions are difficult. So I want to make it clear these are not definitive facts. I never claim to be an expert, I just like speculating. Anyway, let's get to the actual game. I almost forgot my rules for this series, but since it has been a while, some rules have been adjusted. North American releases haven't changed, of course, though I said Zestiria was the ending point, but really it may end up being Berseria if I do want to cover it, or even Arise at this rate. So it'll be ongoing if I ever get to those for now. I'm still not going through and spoiling the entire story for each game, and I really took too much time on that last rule, so needless to say, I'm not going to take that long to make these if I can help it. Okay, and with that, let's check out the Game Boy Advance version of Tales of Phantasia, all of its, glory? Oh, this is going to be interesting one to cover. So when it comes to the Game Boy Advance version, the gist of it is that it's a hybrid port of sorts from the Super Famicom and PlayStation versions, with the opening in the Mode 7 style overworld taken from the Super Famicom, while using the updated visuals and additions from the PlayStation, though it does have its own unique content as well. Let's start with said opening sequence. It begins with a quote from an in-game character actually voiced over in English, as are all the voices are in this, though you'll notice that it's pretty crusty sounding, which is telling for how the sound quality will be. After that is the opening that is similar to the Super Famicom's, except that had a full song with lyrics titled, forgive my white man English for this one, Yumiwa Owanarai by Yokari Yoshida, which was a pretty substantial technical achievement on the system. However, the overseas GBA version doesn't include that song for licensing reasons, and is replaced with another music track, which is par for the course with localized Tales of entries up to this point. Except instead of an original piece, it uses a remixed overworld theme, which doesn't really fit with the timing of these scenes. I would even say it's probably the least fitting and most hastily made replacement for an opening song so far. Not to mention that it originally had some opening credits, but there are none here, just awkwardly long black screen transitions the names originally were on. Starting the game begins with a group of warriors in a desperate fight against a powerful sorcerer, who gets struck by a spell and is sent away to another group who steal him away. In the Super Famicom version, this trippy transition had more opening credits, but of course this version doesn't. About 12 years later, we are introduced to Cress Albane, a son of a master swordsman that runs a training school, who joins his friend Chester Burkelike to hunt some nearby woods. But when they come back, they find their village devastated by an attack that takes the lives of Cress's parents and Chester's sister. Turns out the attackers were after a pendant that was given to Cress. Vowing revenge, Cress sets off while Chester stays behind to bury the bodies and promises to meet up later. But after resting at his uncle's place, said uncle is forced to give Cress to the enemy, which takes his pendant and throws him in a jail. There he meets with a healer named Mint, who was also in prison and had her pendant taken. They soon escape and meet up with Chester and Trinicus D. Morrison, who knew Cress's parents and Mint's mother and was part of the sealing ritual with them, and that both pendants were used to seal the sorcerer away, who is named Dios. So naturally the enemy, a dark knight named Mars, uses them to bring Dios back under the pretense that he will serve him, which of course doesn't go well. Since conventional means won't work on Dios, Morrison sends Cress and Mint back 100 years in time to find a way to stop him. Along the way meeting with Claus, a summoner, and Arch, a half-elf mage, to help in their quest. And while time travel isn't a unique aspect for a Super Nintendo era JRPG, or even JRPGs in general, it's just for key narrative moments. Otherwise, Phantasia's story is still fairly straightforward, if only because this is the first entry in the series. As such, it's best to keep that expectation in check, not to mention whatever expectations for this version of Phantasia you may have. It does still play more or less like the original, with the classic top-down view and Mode 7-esque world map, which in this version for the latter, you can move in 8 directions, which is something new, I guess. And something that actually isn't new and was introduced in the original was grabbing and moving certain objects. Only this does a much better job at teaching and showing that than in Tales of Destiny. This aspect usually comes in during dungeons, which for their time are varied enough and have some interesting puzzle solutions. Some are a little hit or miss, but nothing too egregious. The proper series introduction of the Sorcerer's Ring sometimes comes into play during these too. Only in Phantasia it needs to be equipped as an accessory to be used. That there is some old archaic game design still intact. Granted, some old aspects are going to be there regardless, like random enemy encounters, with one exception in a certain area, but with the frantic nature of these enemies, they're quite difficult to avoid. And the encounter rate can get pretty high at times, even with this version having it tweaked. But you can still use Holy Balls if they start to get on your nerves, or Dark Balls to increase them if you want to get grinding. Not that you really need to. There is even a special item you can get where you can effectively choose those encounter rates for free, but that's deep in a substantial side quest area pretty late in the game. As for the combat, it is primarily based on the PlayStation version, which was based on Tales of Destiny's enhanced linear motion battle system. So if you're one of the 5 or so people outside of Japan like me that actually played Destiny, this will be pretty familiar. Only here on GBA, it's considerably slower compared to Tales of Destiny and the PlayStation port. Even the Super Famicom, while lacking nuances later versions and entries added, is still briskly paced compared to the Game Boy Advance. There's also some restrictions in regards to the controls since there are less buttons to work with here. Basic attacks with A and assign skills with B is fine, but when you try and do other actions, things get cumbersome. L is for shortcut assigned moves, but you only have 2 and they're done by holding L and then A or B. Changing party formation is done by holding R and then up, but down is for holding position, and left and right is for switching targets, so it can be pretty confusing to remember all that at first. But the worst is how you manually block. In Tales of Destiny and subsequently PlayStation Phantasia, blocking was on a dedicated button, but on GBA you need to hold down, then press R. It's perhaps the most unintuitive way I've seen to block in a game like this. Now thankfully by default your characters do block automatically and it's fairly reliable. You would only really need to do this if you wanted to change the full manual control, which you need to get an item to do so anyway, and I never really liked the full manual control in the old Tales of games, so I just stick with semi-auto. So because of that, you may play this without even realizing that there is a block command. I only found that out from seeing in the manual, which lists it near the end and not in the control section. But even with those issues, the combat is still doable enough once you get used to it. And it did include cancel levels, which makes it easier to chain skills together, though perhaps a little too easy. Because there were a few bosses I was able to spam skill attacks and essentially stunlock them to win. It doesn't work on everything, but I still couldn't help but feel like I cheesed those fights. I would still prefer to end the fights quicker than have them drag on as much as they do, especially when characters start casting higher level spells and summons that interrupt the battle constantly. Let's just say I was starting to lose patience when I had 3 spellcasters in my party. You can imagine how those go. Though you can adjust party member strategies, formations, and whatever moves that can be used to help mitigate any annoyances, which are familiar enough options that are here in this version of Phantasia. That sense of serious familiarity does help to carry this game, which does apply to many other things, such as the characters. Our main character Cress is the frontline fighter with short-range weapons that range from swords, axes, and spears, all of which have specific slash and thrust attack stats. Cress can also gain secret skills throughout the game that, after acquiring books and using associated skills enough times to master, can use special combinations of 2 skills. And he can get a special secret skill where, when he's low on health, can execute a powerful attack, but you need to press all 4 buttons at the same time. That's kinda difficult to execute, especially when you're panicking to get it to work while Cress has that low health, but can do some good damage if pulled off. He's pretty much the start of the standard main characters in these games, slightly naive but noble and determined on his quest. Chester is an archer, support attacking with the bow. In the PlayStation version he got some much needed skill attacks, making him much more versatile than only doing basic attacks in the Super Famicom. Now for about half the game you don't have him in the party, but when he does come back you can have a couple of training scenes that not only give Chester some character development, but gain experience in order to level up and catch up faster with the rest of the party. This was also originally added in the PlayStation version, and it is nice to see that Wolf Team was already learning after party members like Chelsea still being low level when they rejoined in Tales of Destiny. Chester bears a heavy burden from the opening village disaster, but still has his moments to shine despite being absent for a chunk of the game. Mint Adonate is the healer of the group, who of course provides recovery as well as support spells that buff the party and inflict stun and other negative effects on enemies. She can attack with the staff, but only as a last resort really given her class. She is the typical soft-spoken but caring and strong-willed character that reflects the compassionate side of the group. Claus F. Lester is a researcher in summon spirits, and gains the power of these summons in order to bypass the fact that humans can't use magic. As such, his summons are acquired by forming pacts with the spirits you come across. Most mandatory during the adventure, but there are optional ones to get as well. And they can be pretty powerful, but the more powerful ones take a while to cast and have some long animations to sit through. But it is neat to see the actual series debut of the summon spirits here, even if they're updated versions. Otherwise, Claus can attack with magic arts books, but these are only standard attacks when enemies get too close since he primarily does summoning. Still, you'd think these kinds of books would do something more, especially since his starting book is the freaking Necronomicon, but I digress. He's somewhat brash and stubborn, but being the oldest does show his maturity and wisdom when needed. Then there's Arch Klein, the aforementioned magic caster who can do some good damage. Well, from the spells you do find for her anyway, as you need to acquire magic spell books for new ones. Otherwise, since she flies in the air on her broom during battles, she can only really attack tall or flying enemies at close range. So that's pretty situational on top of the usual effectiveness of spellcaster melee attacks. Arch is energetic and often short-tempered and lacking tact for comedic effect, but does prove to be a loyal and valuable member. Lastly, there's Suzu Fujibayashi, a ninja girl who was originally just a support NPC, but on the PlayStation and onwards, became an optional party member that can join you. She can't take much damage, but makes up for it with fast attacks up close and being able to throw kunai from a distance as her main attacks. She also has a variety of ninja skills, from creating a shadow clone, deadly sword strikes, ninjutsu style infused projectiles,
And frog.
though like Arch's spells, additional skills need scrolls, which are usually purchased from other ninjas in dungeons. Zuzu tends to be pretty stoic following her strict ninja code, but that resolve does get questioned during emotional moments, and she's not completely immune to silly moments now and then. Overall, the characters are fine, if only because these are the archetypes that started them all. They are a bit limited, and even with the inclusion of Zuzu, you're likely just to play as Crest since he's the most effective fighter. Though you are able to switch out to other characters since the PlayStation if you want to mix things up a little, and don't mind half of them being spellcasters. There's also no multiplayer in this, but given this is on GBA, it would have been a bit of a hassle to use link cables even if they bothered to. What's also not here, at least not technically, are the skits, which actually debuted in the series proper on the PlayStation version of Phantasia, but those were not included in the GBA version likely due to limitations. However, there are still scenes akin to those you can come across to give some needed character moments to flesh them out. These and the cutscenes in general will often give titles to the characters, which is another series staple that originated on the PlayStation Phantasia that is included here. Though like in Tales of Eternia, these are just here for the sake of changing a character's title and don't do anything else except be an in-game achievement system of sorts. Actually, the PlayStation version is pretty much the progenitor for a lot of series features that we wouldn't get until later, like the cooking system, which also originally started in that and is here as well. And it still works like before. You get recipes for dishes, mostly from chefs you come across, which needs ingredients to make for various recovery options in the cooking menu. Though given that this is the first iteration of this system, it's pretty basic. Anyone can make pretty much anything with equal proficiency as far as I could tell, and even with the cooking level going up the more you have a character make a dish, it only adds about an extra 1% of recovery per star, so mastering recipes doesn't seem to do a whole lot here. But the cooking is still an effective way to recover as long as you have ingredients, and it's certainly better than the Super Famicom's food bag system, which I wasn't really a fan of in Tales of Destiny. On top of those features from the PlayStation, its additional side quests are brought over along with new ones that the GBA version brings, so this version actually does have quite a bit of content. And it's usually worth to do these as you get good rewards for doing so. The most noteworthy ones are the eye-free treasure hunts, who made his first series mentioned in the original game, that are in hidden spots all over the world map. And the deeper levels of the Mines of Moria, Morlia, there's an L in there so the token estate can't sue. It's here you can get some of the best items, like that encounter rate changer. But it's also the most difficult in terms of enemy encounters, and you can't use holy bottles, so have fun running this gauntlet of floors if you choose to. And if you do go for everything, the game will run about 40 hours or so, about as long as Tales of Destiny and Eternia, which I guess is a given considering it's the first game, but updated with roughly the amount of content as those. And I can say that playing the PlayStation entries did help me prepare for another return to old Tales of conventions. Though one thing you'll probably pick up on are the similarities this game has to Tales Symphonia in terms of areas and certain story beats. That and borrowing from Norse mythology, though Phantasia is more upfront with that. And the reason for Symphonia making intentional callbacks to Phantasia is because those two games are actually connected, albeit very distantly timeline-wise in that Symphonia takes place before Phantasia. So it is possible that Zuzu is a descendant of Sheena. I still think it's funny that since this came out after Symphonia, this will likely remind you of Symphonia instead of the other way around that the Japanese players had. But playing this after Symphonia still works timeline-wise, so it works both ways, really. That is, of course, if you're willing to go through the GBA version because, well, I think it's finally about time to go over the more well-known issues this has. I already mentioned how slow the combat is, but slowdown can also happen while running around, usually in larger town and dungeon areas. At first I thought this may have been my Retron 5 not running the game well, but after testing the game on actual GBA hardware, it does seem to struggle a little here, just that it's more noticeable when upscaled in high resolutions. If anything, a few graphical bugs and the game outright crashing at a particular spot was likely because of the Retron, but I'm not entirely sure. Screen crunch from bringing this to the GBA resolution can also have some issues, not so much during the game itself, but in the menus. Since they are cramped, you need to press L to bring up if equipment you're buying is better for characters, and select to cycle through item description and stats, so there's some fumbling just to see all that information. Another thing is that since this was in development just before the Game Boy Advance SP, the visuals are brighter and more saturated to compensate for the original GBA's dark non-backlit screen. Needless to say, playing on something other than original hardware will be overly bright, to the point where I had a hard time seeing whether I had character moves disabled or not, so you may need to fiddle around with some brightness settings to see that better. Otherwise, I still do like the updated visuals that were carried over here, such as the character designs from Kosuke Fujishima, who did debut his series designs with the portraits and box art from the Super Famicom, with these more accurately matching the in-game characters on the PlayStation onwards. Though porting the PlayStation sprites to GBA did take a hit in their resolution, and there were times I could tell things weren't as updated as the rest of the game. And then there's the sound, which some of you watching this already know what this version's reputation is when it comes to that, and it isn't favorable. I already mentioned that this does have English voices and is the only version of Phantasia thus far that has them. Only problem is that they are very compressed, which results in some hilariously bit-crushed voices. It doesn't exactly leave a great first impression when you hear it right away with the voice quote upon boot up and with the intro cutscene of Dios getting sealed away.
What the heck is that?
And the main character's voice clips don't fare any better. In fact, I think they're worse. I will still give the localization team credit for at least trying when back in Tales of Destiny, that still just used Japanese voice clips. While in this version of Phantasia, they do have an English voice cast providing clips like in Destiny and PlayStation Phantasia, with attacking and getting hit noises, shouting out skill and spell names, and victory lines for whoever landed the finishing blow in a battle. But good luck trying to understand what some of them are trying to say for their victories the first time you hear them.
I never.
Please don't hate me.
Move on.
Though if anything, I do find these voice samples amusing over how low quality they sound. But it is kinda sad the only time we've gotten these characters speaking English is this version. Even when you compare them to the Super Famicom clips, sure, they were muffled, but still sounded good for that system at the time. And it's not like the GBA can't do decent voice samples either, just take a listen to these examples.
Bug time! The sun is in your hand!
In a place not too far from here and now, the end of the world approaches.
Choose a game. Super Mario 2.
This is as far as you go!
Okay, maybe it depends on who you ask, but in GBA Phantasia, they're likely just super compressed in order to fit them all on top of a fairly long RPG. And you know what else took a hit from the sound compression? The music. It's often a complaint that the Game Boy Advance sound chip doesn't do the Super Nintendo music quite as good when it comes to GBA ports, and Tales of Phantasia is no exception. On its own, the original melodies from series debut composers Motoi Sakuruba and Shichi Tamura are still here and have that trademark style that would go on for the rest of the series onward, but it's as soon as you compare these versions with the Super Famicoms, and especially the PlayStation CD tracks, is when you realize how much of a downgrade the soundtrack on GBA is. Although I guess if this is the only version of the music you ever fully hear, it's not that terrible, for Game Boy Advance at least, but it's very difficult to disassociate the lower sound quality compared to the other versions. Speaking of things that are hard to disassociate, there is one issue that's perhaps the biggest elephant, or rather a certain other animal, in the room. Let's talk about the translation. Like I said earlier, this was outsourced to Bone Global Solutions, and I would say the translation was okay, maybe not great, as there were a few hiccups like Ifreed being a more phonetically spelled Ifreed, despite Ifreed being an established recurring character name at this point in the series. I guess Bone didn't get the memo or figured this spelling was easier to read the correct pronunciation. However, there is one mistake that is so bewildering that it almost single-handedly destroys this game's translation reputation. At one point, the word Ragnarok was changed to kangaroo. Ah yes, my favorite God of War game. Now you might be wondering, how the hell does that even happen? Well, it's been surmised that given the amount of text that would be on an Excel spreadsheet file, as that was a standard for text editing game scripts like this then, Bone very likely used a word processor with the spell correct tool to proofread the script. And it turns out Ragnarok does get flagged as a misspelled word, with the first corrected suggestion indeed being kangaroo on versions of word processors that would have likely been used at the time. I can even prove that in the very same word processor I'm using for this script. Yes, I still use a word processor this old for my videos, don't judge. So because of that, it essentially got autocorrected into everyone's favorite marsupial. Of course, you also have to ask, how did no one notice this before? Well, as ridiculous as this is, it is only one word in the entirety of the script where this happens, so it was simply overlooked. Probably at the last minute when they ran a final spell check and accidentally hit replace on Ragnarok. And even if someone saw this, they probably went, kangaroo? That's weird, but whatever, this is a fantasy RPG. Plus, it's actually not that surprising for games to have mistakes from some simple typos that you would think quality control would catch, so it does happen. And I would still argue that the rest of the translation is still serviceable in that it gets the job done, though that likely won't be convincing since the kangaroo's mishap's reputation precedes itself for this game, to the point where, along with the other issues this version has, most Tales of fans will recommend alternative methods to play Tales of Phantasia. Because back in 2001, DJAP released a fan translation patch for the Super Famicom version of Tales of Phantasia, and it is still the only unofficial way to play the original Phantasia in English. However, this is over 20 years old, and let's just say it takes some liberties at times with its translation, such as the most infamous line where Claus talks about Arch having a, characteristic of a tiger. First a kangaroo and now a tiger. Kangaroos and tigers in translations, oh my! In the original Japanese, moments like that never go that far, just suggestive for the sake of lightheartedness humor. But DJAP often goes beyond that, to where they're no longer suggestive, just very blunt. I know those that have played and are attached to it since before the GBA release will disagree, but I'm personally not a fan of the DJAP translation. And I'm not saying that just because of the tiger line, much like how people still don't like the official translation even when you take away the kangaroo line. I guess it's a fight between a kangaroo and a tiger for the most absurd translation animal. While I won't say the GBA translation is that good over DJAP's, I do think it's not that bad as some people say it is, but I know some of you are going to disagree on that one too. I'm not looking forward to the comments section in this. Sure, the GBA can be pretty milquetoast, and this part of the game undergoes some changes, like the characters having a 4Kids style edit of having a buffet instead of drinking. Though considering there is underage drinking, mostly from Arch of course, this aspect wouldn't get localized here regardless. While I won't discredit the work that went into translating the Super Famicom version, I feel that DJAP goes too far in the opposite direction at times, as if they were rebelling against the localization censorship these RPGs tend to undergo. And it's not like the GBA translation doesn't retain the suggestive humor bits, just maybe a little toned down. And it could be worse. Claus could have been named Clark like in his cameo in Tales of Eternia, or like when Final Fantasy V was first translated on the PlayStation in the Anthology Collection, with lines like, "You got the hots for her," and have Ferris just be on Talk Like a Pirate Day for her dialogue. So Phantasia doesn't get as ridiculous as that aside from the kangaroo error, but it often comes down between an official translation that people find too soft versus a fan one that goes, well, too hard. Like a tiger. Though if you want a balanced translation that more faithfully follows the Japanese script, there are fan translations of the PlayStation version, so that may be the recommended unofficial way to play Tales of Phantasia right now. But since the GBA release, other versions have come out, such as the full voice edition on the PSP the same year as the North American GBA release, which then later got a cross edition with new content such as an additional party member that was included in Nariki Dungeon X remake of the Japanese-only Phantasia sequel in 2010. That same year, a cell phone version also released, which was actually based on the Game Boy Advance version, all of which didn't get overseas releases. But there is one version that did. The iOS version. And if you thought the GBA port was bad, you have not experienced playing it on this. It released back in 2014 as a free-to-play download, and I did play a bit of it, or at least attempted to. I even recorded it back then for this retrospective, although it was a little messy since it was before I had methods to effectively bypass HDCP. It's the same kind of recordings as those iOS Evil Dead games I did. Anyway, this version of Phantasia is based on the PSP version, so it does have the visuals and audio from that, along with a new English translation, though no English voices. It also has the animated intro since the PS1 version, which is nice to see in a Western release finally. It still doesn't have the original opening music, but does have an orchestrated piece that's better suited here than the GBA. And those are the only positives I have for this. To say this wasn't very good would be an understatement. You have to play the entire game with touch controls, which are awkward and don't work very well. To navigate, you either have to use a virtual joystick, which I never really was a fan of in mobile games, or tap to go to a selected area, the latter of which can get very aggravating when you keep getting loud buzzes every time you tap somewhere you can't go to or interact with. Battles are also a chore since actions are touch area dependent and quite cumbersome to do specific moves and assign skills. And if that wasn't bad enough, they had the goal for the game to be on a higher battle difficulty that you can't change, and have in-game purchases for items, one of which revives you and gives you buffs. So they intentionally made this version difficult to try and force people to spend money. It's absolutely disgusting. I went as far as the dungeon where Dios gets released before giving up, and I didn't want to give him a single cent over this deliberate design choice just to continue. Needless to say, this version is really bad, and critics agreed. And because of that, and the fact it always needed to be connected online, for microtransactions in a single-player RPG, it didn't even last a year before getting shut down and delisted. I know game preservation is important, but quite frankly, I'm glad this went away, at least in the state that it was in. And this is coming from someone that actually got that bad Double Dragon 2 remake before the Xbox 360 store closed.
It's gotta be a static thing. It can't be like those weird bot followers that follow and then the count goes down next day. None of that weird stuff.
So because you can't really get that iOS version anymore, not that you want to anyway, the Game Boy Advance, by default, is still the definitive English version.
Default, default, default!
Sales-wise, this version did sell over 300,000 copies, but the majority was from Japan naturally, with an estimated less than 100,000 sold in North America. So not the worst selling Tales of game here, but not great. And the review scores were unsurprisingly lukewarm, though IGN did say the graphic and audio quality held up relatively well. I thought I was being generous. Of course, the only way to get this game now is buying it secondhand, with the cartridge itself not being too expensive, while complete a box is more pricey. But that's only if you really want a copy for Tales of Collection's sake. Otherwise, if you haven't done so already, there are the fan translations. I'd lean towards the PlayStation ones, but there's always the DChap translation if you want to play the original in all of its Tiger Fortification glory. Also, fun fact, I'm able to play that through my actual Super Famicom's cartridge on the Retron 5. It's either that or get a reproduction card if I want to play the original Phantasia in English on some sort of physical media. Tales of Phantasia on Game Boy Advance is an interesting version, but obviously not an optimal one. The sound quality and the slowness of battles alone are probably what will turn you away the most if the reputation didn't do so already. However, I still had an okay enough time playing through this. It was nice to finally play the first entry, even if this isn't the best version, but the series charm is still there under that GBA hardware. Between this and Tales of Legendia, I'm glad to be past these lower points of this series since I had mixed feelings on both of them. Though between the two, Legendia may have the better combat and technical qualities, but GBA Phantasia just edges out ahead for being more consistent with the story and characters as a series introduction and not all over the place like Legendia was. Not to mention being able to do content that doesn't lock you out for half of the game and having to go through all the dungeons twice. And while there isn't a great system for New Game Plus stuff, you can still carry over your monster and collector's list, which I somehow only missed a couple of things on despite following a complete guide, but whatever. And you do unlock a post-minigame mode called Let's Go Arch, where you play as Arch and Zuzu to try and complete as many requests as you can within a time limit. It's a cute little addition for this. But even with that, it doesn't detract that this is still frustratingly the only localized way to play the first Tales of game as of this video. And considering that Phantasia has sold over 1.4 million copies across all of its versions in Japan and gotten a short anime series, it's a popular first entry that deserves better over here and not the actual worst versions we did get. But who knows, next year is the 30th anniversary of this game and the series, so maybe we'll get something new from that. Like a new remake or an HD version of the Cross Edition, I'd sit on that. You could even salvage the English iOS translation for most of that, if that even is possible. But there is a cynical part of me that's guessing we'll just get the GBA version of the Switch Online Game Boy Advance games, with the kangaroo line still intact. I hope I'm wrong, but we shall see. Awkward addition due to news after this was filmed and written. Tales of Grace's F is getting a remaster, and other games in the series may be getting that treatment afterwards as well. It's likely going to be the PS3 games first since those got delisted a while back, but there might still be a possibility we could see Phantasia again someday. In the meantime, the next game is Tales of the Abyss, which I'm sure will have nicer things to say than GBA Phantasia. And I can guarantee this won't take nearly as long to get to as this did. I can promise you that at least.